The previous records had carried us to the edge of a strange stillness, a moment where action no longer advances, but the framework remains intact. From that stillness, the earliest written material of southern Mesopotamia begins to speak in an unexpected way, not through stories of arrival, but through routines that assume arrival has already occurred. In the oldest god lists recovered from the early cities, the Anunnaki do not enter the record as newcomers. Their names appear without introduction, placed into ordered columns alongside offerings, cultic assignments, and spatial associations. There is no preface, no narrative explanation of when these beings first became relevant. The lists read as inventories, not chronicles. Each name occupies a position, as if it had always been there, as if the task of the scribe were not to explain presence, but to maintain its correct arrangement. Offering records reinforce this impression. In tablets concerned with daily distributions, grain, beer, livestock, the divine recipients are treated as fixed endpoints in an administrative system. The texts do not describe gods descending, appearing, or demanding recognition. Instead, they assume an established relationship. Goods are allocated because allocation is required. Presence, in these documents, is not an event. It is a condition. This distinction matters because Sumerian writing, when it wishes to record events, is capable of doing so. Economic fluctuations, boundary disputes, temple rebuilds, and royal accessions are all marked explicitly. When something begins, scribes often note it. When something changes, they specify how. Against this background, the absence of any textual moment in which the Anunnaki are said to arrive is striking. The silence is not due to narrative incapacity, but to narrative choice. The same pattern appears in temple dedication records. Early inscriptions name sanctuaries as belonging to specific divine figures, sometimes noting restoration after damage or neglect. What they do not describe is the initial claiming of the space. A temple is not founded because a god has just come. It is rebuilt because it has always belonged. The logic is circular but stable. Ownership precedes memory, and memory precedes explanation. This historiographic posture suggests that, for the scribes compiling these records, the question of arrival was not relevant to the functioning of the system they were preserving. Divine presence was treated as an inherited fact, not a historical development. The Anunnaki appear as part of the background architecture of reality, embedded in lists, schedules, and spatial assignments. Their authority is not argued for, it is administered. What becomes even more telling is that this assumed presence does not later give way to a recorded departure. As centuries pass and the corpus of tablets expands, gods continue to receive offerings, titles remain stable, and divine names persist in legal formulas. Yet nowhere do the records pause to explain a transition from presence to absence. There is no administrative acknowledgement of withdrawal, no ritual accounting for loss of access, no tablet that records the moment when gods stop arriving because they no longer do. Instead, the documentation subtly shifts in emphasis. Early records are concerned with correct placement and distribution, as if divine proximity were taken for granted. Later records maintain the same structures, but increasingly emphasize maintenance rather than interaction. The gods are still addressed, but they are addressed through forms. The living immediacy of presence is replaced by procedural continuity. This suggests not a dramatic departure, but the Anunnaki remain part of the system, but their role becomes increasingly abstract. They are less often associated with actions, and more consistently with legitimacy. Their names authorize boundaries, validate kingship, and sanctify institutions. Present becomes less experiential and more archival. Such a transformation would not require explanation within the logic of the scribal tradition. The task of the archive was not to narrate cosmic change, but to ensure that inherited structures remained legible. If divine authority had shifted from active involvement to symbolic oversight, the archive would simply continue its work. Silence, in this context, is not absence of knowledge, but evidence of administrative sufficiency. This raises a methodological problem for modern readers. If arrival is never described because it predates the archive, and departure is never described because it does not disrupt the archive, then the most significant transition to change in how gods relate to the world would be visible only indirectly. It would appear not as a story, but as a change in how records function. Early god lists and offering tablets, therefore, do not tell us what happened to the Anunnaki in narrative terms. What they reveal is how presence was normalized, and how its eventual transformation did not require comment. The scribes wrote as custodians of continuity, not witnesses to endings. For them, the system did not collapse when gods stopped arriving. It continued, slightly altered, under the same names. If the earliest texts already treat divine presence as inherited, and later texts preserve that inheritance without describing its transformation, then where, if anywhere, would the departure have been registered if, not in stories, then perhaps in the changing language of authority itself? The records continue without interruption, but their grammar begins to change. Where earlier texts treated divine presence as a stable condition, a small number of compositions preserve something more fleeting. Moments where the Anunnaki still act. These moments are not numerous, and they do not form a continuous narrative. They appear instead as scattered verbal traces, embedded in hymns and liturgical texts whose primary purpose is not storytelling, but alignment. In these hymns, verbs matter. The Anunnaki are described as assigning destinies, fixing boundaries, confirming offices. The language is precise and restrained. Actions are not dramatic. They are administrative in character. To decree, to establish, to measure, to set in place, these are not gestures of arrival or departure, but of regulation. The gods act not by appearing, but by ordering. What is striking is how limited this verbal window appears to be. In later compositions, the same divine figures are still named, still invoked, still positioned at the top of cosmological hierarchies, yet the verbs fall away. The Anunnaki are no longer described as doing. They are described as having done. Authority remains, but action recedes into the past tense or disappears entirely. This shift can be traced across versions of hymns copied centuries apart. Early exemplars include phrases that attribute decisive acts to collective divine assemblies. Later copies preserve the names and titles but replace verbs of action with formulas of acknowledgement. The gods are honored, feared, referenced but no longer shown intervening. The text no longer records motion, only structure. Such a change does not announce itself. There is no explicit statement that divine action has ceased. The scribes do not note a transition or justify a silence. Instead, the silence enters through syntax. Verbs once necessary become optional. Clauses that once described decisions now merely affirm authority. The Anunnaki remain present linguistically, but their presence is static. This suggests that, for the scribes transmitting these hymns, the role of the Anunnaki was understood as complete. The essential acts had already been performed. What remained was maintenance of memory, of order, of legitimacy. The gods did not need to continue acting because their actions had already shaped the framework within which everything else operated. The hymns themselves reinforce this interpretation. They are not composed to record new divine deeds, but to rehearse established relationships. Their function is not to update the archive, but to stabilize it. When they refer to divine actions, they do so as foundational moments, not ongoing processes. Action is compressed into origin, even when origin is not explicitly narrated. In T's light, the disappearance of active verbs does not imply absence. It implies sufficiency. The Anunnaki no longer need to act because the system they instituted no longer requires adjustment. Their authority persists precisely because it has become embedded. Action gives way to reference. Intervention gives way to precedent. This transition aligns with a broader scribal tendency to privilege continuity over novelty. Once an action has been inscribed and accepted, repeating it becomes unnecessary. The archive does not record the same decision twice. If divine action belonged to a formative phase, later generations would inherit its results without needing to restate the process. Yet the absence of later actions raises a quiet problem. If the Anunnaki no longer act within the texts, how do changes occur? Kings rise and fall. Cities expand and collapse. Laws are revised. Rituals adapted. These changes are recorded, but divine agency is no longer described as initiating them. Authority remains overhead, but causation shifts downward into human institutions. The hymns thus preserve the last moments when divine action was linguistically visible. After that point, the Anunnaki become guarantors rather than participants. Their names anchor legitimacy, but they do not move the narrative forward. The world continues, but the gods no longer propel it through recorded deeds. This does not mean the scribes believed the gods were inactive. It means that activity was no longer the appropriate category through which to describe divine authority. Action had become history. Authority had become structure. The Anunnaki were no longer actors in time, but references beyond it. If the final named actions of the Anunnaki mark the point at which divine agency receded into precedent, then what replaced action as the primary link between gods and the world end? How would that replacement be expressed not through verbs but through the language of power itself? If action had receded into precedent, the language that remained had to carry authority without movement. In royal inscriptions, this transition becomes visible not through what is added, but through what quietly shifts position. The Anunnaki do not disappear from these texts. Instead, they change grammatical roles. In the earliest inscriptions associated with kingship, divine names sometimes occupy the subject position of clauses, te Anunnaki, collectively or through leading figures, described as establishing kingship, assigning rule, or determining the order of the land. These verbs align them with agency. They act, and the king follows. Authority flows downward from a source that is linguistically active. Over time, this structure changes. The Anunnaki are no longer subjects who act upon the world. They become objects of reference. Kings rule by them, under them, or according to their decrees. The grammatical center shifts away from divine action toward human execution. The gods are still present, but they now occupy the background of the sentence rather than its engine. This semantic drift is subtle, but consistent. Where earlier texts say that the Anunnaki established or appointed, later inscriptions say that the king was established or was appointed, with the divine names appearing in subordinate clauses. The gods authorize, but they no longer initiate. Their role is no longer temporal, but genealogical. This linguistic repositioning turns the Anunnaki into ancestors of authority rather than participants in governance. They are treated as the origin from which legitimacy descends, not as figures who continue to intervene. In T's sensi, divine authority becomes inherited rather than renewed. Each king does not receive kingship anew. He inherits a structure whose origin lies beyond his reach. Royal titles reinforce this shift. Instead of emphasizing direct instruction or command, titles increasingly stress continuity. Chosen according to ancient decree, ruling in accordance with established order, maintaining what has long been fixed. The Anunnaki are invoked, not as voices speaking now, but as guarantors of what was already determined. Such language suggests that the scribes understood kingship as operating within a closed framework. The essential decisions had been made before recorded time. What remained was proper alignment with those decisions. The Anunnaki, as ancestral authorities, functioned less like rulers and more like foundations. One does not converse with a foundation, one builds upon it. This change also affects how responsibility is distributed in the texts. When outcomes are successful, kings credit their adherence to divine order. When outcomes fail, the blame is often localized ritual error, improper observance, neglect of tradition. The Anunnaki are not depicted as withdrawing favor through new actions. Rather, misalignment with inherited order produces consequences automatically. The grammatical distance between gods and events thus mirrors an administrative logic. Authority no longer arrives through speech or presence. It persists through documentation. The archive replaces interaction. To know the will of the Anunnaki, one does not wait for revelation. One consults precedent. This is particularly evident in boundary inscriptions and legal declarations. Divine names appear as witnesses rather than judges. They oversee, but they do not rule on individual cases. Their authority is invoked to stabilize decisions already made, not to introduce new ones. The gods certify the record. They do not revise it. Such usage implies that the Anunnaki had become part of historical memory rather than contemporary experience. Their role was to legitimize continuity, not to disrupt it. Linguistically, they resemble revered ancestors whose authority derives from their position at the beginning of things. Their power lies in having acted once, decisively, and in never needing to act again. This transformation does not suggest disappearance. It suggests elevation. By moving out of the realm of action, the Anunnaki become untouchable by circumstance. They are no longer entangled in events that could challenge their authority. Instead, they stand behind all events, silently underwriting them. Yet this raises a further question. If the Anunnaki had become ancestral guarantors rather than active participants, then how did kings understand their own relationship to power in the absence of ongoing instruction, and what language replaced command once command was no longer described? The linguistic repositioning of the Anunnaki altered not only how divine authority was described, but how kings understood their own role within it. Once instruction was no longer narrated as an ongoing exchange, kingship itself had to be The record responds not with explanation, but with a recalibration of titles. In earlier formulations, royal inscriptions sometimes preserve the sense of immediacy. A king is selected, confirmed, or guided through divine action. The language implies a moment of reception, as if authority were granted in real time. Over successive generations, this immediacy dissolves. The verbs that once implied instruction fade, replaced by nouns and adjectives that stress continuity. Kings are no longer those who are told. They are those who inherit. Royal titles begin to emphasize descent, restoration, and alignment. A king rules because he stands within an established line, not because he has received a new directive. He is described as true shepherd or legitimate ruler, not by virtue of fresh command, but because he maintains what has already been fixed. Authority becomes something possessed, not transmitted. This shift reflects a deeper change in political theology. If divine instruction is no longer described as ongoing, then governance must function without direct consultation. The king does not wait for orders. He consults records, traditions, and precedents. The divine realm, once imagined as communicative, becomes archival. To rule correctly is to rule in accordance with inherited order. The inscriptions support this reading, where divine speech once justified action. Later texts justify action through conformity. A king repairs a temple according to ancient plan. He restores rights as they were established. The Anunnaki are invoked not as speakers, but as originators whose decisions lie in the past. Kingship is no longer a dialogue. It is a custodial role. This custodianship is reinforced through language of stewardship rather than obedience. Kings present themselves as caretakers of a system that predates them. Their legitimacy depends not on revelation, but on restraint. Innovation is rarely celebrated. Stability is the highest praise is not that a king changed the order, but that he preserved it. Such language suggests that kings did not experience the absence of instruction as a loss. On the contrary, it appears as a normalization. The world is assumed to be intelligible through inherited frameworks. Divine will is not hidden. It is already known, embedded in law, ritual, and architecture. To rule well is to read correctly. This political theology reduces the need for divine intervention without diminishing divine authority. The Anunnaki remain supreme, but their supremacy is exercised indirectly. They do not command, they authorize. Their will is not expressed through speech, but through structure. Kings act within that structure, accountable not to new commands, but to ancient standards. The absence of instruction also redistributes responsibility. When decisions succeed or fail, the outcome is attributed to human alignment or misalignment. The gods are no longer portrayed as correcting errors through fresh directives. Instead, error itself becomes evidence of deviation from inherited order. The king is responsible for knowing the system well enough not to require instruction. This is visible in how failure is recorded. Disruption is not blamed on divine silence, but on human neglect. Temples fall into disrepair because they were not maintained. Rituals fail because they were not performed correctly. The Anunnaki do not withdraw guidance. Guidance has already been given, long ago, and preserved in form. The king's role, then, is not to receive messages, but to embody continuity. His authority rests on his ability to stand as a living link between origin and present. Titles stress this role explicitly. He is described as the one who holds fast to decrees, who keeps order, who does not alter what was established. Power lies in conservation. Such a model of kingship only functions if the divine past is considered complete. Instruction ceases not because the gods have vanished, but because instruction has reached sufficiency. The Anunnaki no longer speak because there is nothing left to say. Their will has been fully articulated through the system itself. Yet this raises an inevitable uncertainty. If kings no longer receive instructions and authority rests entirely on inherited forms, how does a system respond when those forms no longer fit changing realities? And who, if anyone, has the power to adapt what was never meant to be altered? The inherited authority that no longer required instruction found its most durable expression in stone and brick. When kings ceased to describe receiving new guidance, temples began to reveal how far continuity itself could function as policy. The architectural record does not announce this shift, it simply repeats itself. Across southern Mesopotamia, temple rebuilds follow an unmistakable pattern. When sanctuaries are damaged by flood, fire, or neglect, inscriptions do not describe redesign. They record restoration. The language is consistent. The structure is rebuilt as before, according to its ancient ground plan, in its rightful place. The emphasis is not on improvement, but on fidelity. Archaeological layers confirm this textual habit. Foundations aligned with earlier foundations, even when rebuilding would have allowed for alteration. Wall thicknesses, orientations, and internal layouts persist across centuries. The temples change in scale as resources allow, but not in concept. Their form is treated as settled, not provisional. What is missing from these records is explanation. No text poses to justify why an old plan must be followed. No king claims to have received new architectural instruction from the gods. The Anunnaki are named as owners of the temples, but not as designers issuing fresh commands. The blueprint is assumed to pre-exist the rebuild. This suggests that, within the institutional imagination of the cities, temple design belonged to an authoritative past. Architecture was not a field of experimentation, it was a medium of memory. To alter a temple significantly would not be innovation, it would be deviation. The builders themselves appear to have understood this constraint. Construction records focus on materials, labor, and completion, not conceptual decisions. Bricks are counted, foundations measured, offerings recorded. The intellectual work of design is absent because it is not considered work at all. Design has already been done. Such inertia is not the result of stagnation, but of confidence. A system that believes its foundational order is complete does not seek new forms. It preserves existing ones. Temples thus become physical archives, embodying decisions made before recorded time and reaffirmed through repetition. This continuity also alters how divine presence is expressed spatially. Early on, temples may have functioned as sites of interaction. Over time, they function as anchors. The god does not arrive to inhabit a newly designed space. The space already belongs. Rebuilding restores access. It does not renew relationships. The absence of new blueprints parallels the absence of new instruction. Both reflect a belief that the essential arrangement of the world has already been fixed. Architecture becomes a conservative force, resisting reinterpretation. To maintain the correct plan is to maintain cosmic order. This attitude is reinforced by the language of restoration inscriptions. Kings do not boast of creativity. They emphasize humility. They present themselves as returning the temple to its proper state, often describing neglect by predecessors as the cause of decay. Authority lies not in redesigning, but in remembering correctly, even when cities rise and fall. This logic persists. A conqueror who rebuilds a temple adopts the same plan as the defeated ruler. Legitimacy depends on continuity with the structure. It's a divine past, not on political victory. The temple outlasts regimes because it embodies a deeper order. From an institutional perspective, this makes sense. If divine authority is no longer communicated through speech, then space becomes one of its primary expressions. The correct orientation, the correct layout, the correct sequence of rooms all encode a theology that no longer needs to be articulated verbally. The building itself instructs, yet this architectural silence also raises questions. If no new blueprints are issued, how are changing needs accommodated? Shrines expand, courtyards widen, storage areas increase, but always within inherited limits. The system adapts by accumulation, not by redesign. Growth occurs through addition, not transformation. This method preserves legitimacy while allowing survival, but it also binds the present tightly to the past. Architecture becomes a discipline of restraint. The temple does not ask what the gods now require. It assumes what they once established remains sufficient. In such a world, innovation risks appearing as error. To change the plan would imply that the original order was incomplete. The absence of new architectural guidance thus mirrors a deeper conviction that the divine framework is finished. If temples continue to be rebuilt without new blueprints, preserving forms whose origins are no longer explained, then where is adaptation permitted to occur, and which parts of the system are allowed to change when the sacred architecture itself is not? The architectural restraint that preserved old forms did not prevent technical complexity from continuing elsewhere. In the accounting rooms attached to temples and palaces, numbers moved with a precision that did not require explanation. The mathematics persisted quietly, without manuals, without prefaces, without justification. Administrative tablets from the late 4th and early 3rd millennia already display a fully operational numerical system. Quantities are recorded using place value, proportional ratios, and conversions that assume shared competence. The basic structure appears not as an innovation being tested, but as a tool already mastered. The tablets do not teach the system. They use Italiano. This is significant because the scribal record is otherwise attentive to instruction. Lexical lists explain terminology. Model contracts demonstrate legal form. School tablets show repetitive exercises designed to transmit skills. Yet for mathematics itself, Physically, its underlying logic, there is a striking absence of explanatory text. No tablet explains why 60 functions is a base, how fractions should be derived, or how equivalences are calculated. The system arrives intact, embedded in practice. Accounting records assume that scribes understand not only notation, but abstraction. Grain rations are converted across units. Labor days are calculated against seasonal cycles. Large-scale redistribution requires proportional reasoning across thousands of entries. Errors are corrected, not explained. Mathematics functions as infrastructure. This suggests that numerical knowledge was treated as inherited competence rather than acquired insight. A scribe did not learn mathematics by reading theory. He learned by participating in a system where the rules were already settled. The logic lived in procedure, not in exposition. The tablets reinforce this interpretation through their silence. When a complex calculation appears, it is not marked as exceptional. There is no indication that difficulty requires commentary. The numbers simply align, as if the act of recording were sufficient proof of understanding. Such confidence implies that the origins of the system lay beyond the scope of the archive. Just as temples were rebuilt, according to ancient plans, calculations were performed according to inherited structures. The scribes were not inventors, they were operators. Their task was to maintain accuracy, not to question foundations. This inheritance is visible in how errors are handled. Corrections are practical, not conceptual. A miscount is fixed by recalculation, not by restating principles. The system itself is never reconsidered. It is treated as stable, reliable, and authoritative. The persistence of basic STEAM mathematics across generations and regions further supports this view. Even as political power shifts and cities rise or fall, the numerical framework remains consistent. It is portable, transferable, and resistant to local variation. Such durability suggests that mathematics functioned as a shared language of administration, insulated from historical disruption. What is absent from the record is any moment of adoption. There is no transitional phase where alternative bases compete. No debate recorded between systems. No justification for why one method prevails. The mathematics appears fully formed, already integrated into economic life. In this respect, numerical practice mirrors other inherited structures. Authority once derived from active divine agency now rests in preserved systems. Mathematics does not require divine instruction because it already embodies order. Its correctness is demonstrated through function, not through appeal to origin. The lack of instructional texts does not imply ignorance. It implies sufficiency. The system worked, and therefore it endured. Its origins were irrelevant to its operation. Like the Anunnaki themselves, mathematics receded from narrative into structure. For the scribes, numbers were not abstractions, but instruments of stability. They ensured fair distribution, predictable obligation, and measurable accountability. In a world where divine instruction was no longer described as ongoing, mathematics provided certainty without speech. Yet this raises a subtle question. If such a complex numerical system could be preserved without explanation, transmitted through practice alone, Then where was its origin anchored and? Was it understood as human invention, or as part of the same inherited order that no longer required instruction? The numerical discipline that governed grain and labor extended upward into the sky, where order was observed rather than explained. In the astronomical tablets of Mesopotamia, the heavens appear not as a stage for divine action, but as a system to be recorded with care. The stars move, the scribes note, and the record proceeds without commentary. Early star lists arrange constellations, paths, and seasonal markers in orderly sequences. Names are given, positions fixed, intervals noted. The texts do not describe God's placing the stars, nor do they recount moments of celestial creation. The sky is already structured. The task of the observer is not to interpret origin, but to preserve alignment. This approach contrasts sharply with mythological expectation. One might anticipate stories explaining why stars matter or how divine beings govern their movement. Instead, the tablets read like inventories. A constellation rises. At a certain time, a star culminates at a certain point. The record is procedural, not narrative. Omen texts follow the same pattern. Celestial phenomena are correlated with terrestrial outcomes through fixed associations. An eclipse occurs. A consequence is listed. The logic is conditional, not explanatory. The gods are rarely described as acting in response. The event itself carries meaning by virtue of its place within an established system. This mechanical treatment suggests that divine oversight of the sky was assumed to be complete. The heavens did not require ongoing supervision or explanation because their order was already secured. The scribes do not ask why a star rises. They record that it does. The authority of the sky lies in its regularity, not in divine intervention. The absence of commentary is consistent across generations of texts. Later copies refine measurements, adjust lists, and improve precision, but they do not introduce stories. The sky becomes increasingly technical, increasingly abstracted from divine narrative. Observation replaces invocation. This shift aligns with broader institutional patterns. Just as mathematics functioned without theoretical explanation, astronomy operated without theological elaboration. Knowledge was validated through repetition and accuracy, not through appeal to divine speech. The system worked, and therefore it was trusted. Ritual precision depended on this trust. Festivals, offerings, and administrative cycles were tied to celestial markers. The correctness of ritual timing relied on the predictability of the sky. Yet the texts do not record gods correcting errors or announcing changes. Adjustment occurs through observation, not revelation. The scribe's role was therefore observational rather than interpretive. They did not speak for the gods. They tracked the sky. Their authority derived from consistency, not inspiration. The heavens became a referenced framework, much like law or architecture, inherited and resistant to reinterpretation. This treatment of astronomy implies that celestial order was considered autonomous. The Anunnaki are not absent, but they are not present as agents. Their authority is embedded in the stability of the system itself. The sky does not need divine commentary because it already expresses divine order. Such a view reframes the relationship between gods and cosmos. Instead of ongoing oversight, there is completed design. The sky is no longer a site of interaction, but of confirmation. Each recorded movement reaffirms a structure that requires no explanation. The lack of narrative does not diminish the sacredness of the sky. On the contrary, it elevates it beyond speech. To narrate would be to localize authority in time. By refusing narrative, the texts preserve the heavens as timeless. This has implications for how change is understood. When celestial patterns shift subtly over centuries, the response is technical recalibration, not theological revision. The system adapts quietly through measurement. Divine will is not renegotiated. It is assumed to remain constant. In this way, astronomy mirrors the broader transformation of divine presence. The gods no longer act within time. Their order endures across it. Observation replaces dialogue. Precision replaces instruction. If the heavens could be read and maintained without divine commentary, functioning as a self-validating system, then how did this same logic shape other domains, where order was once thought to require direct divine judgment? The observational come that governed the sky finds a parallel on the ground, where law begins to operate without a visible lawgiver. In the earliest legal tablets, authority is present, but speech is not. Rules exist. Penalties are specified. Procedures are followed, yet no voice announces them into being. These legal records are practical documents. They record disputes, compensations, obligations, and resolutions. Their language is concise and formulaic. A condition is stated. An outcome follows. What is absent is explanation. The tablets do not preserve moments of revelation, nor do they record divine pronouncements that introduce new laws. The law is already there. In later monumental law codes, divine figures are sometimes named as guarantors, but even there, the structure is telling. The gods authorize. They do not legislate line by line. Their role is to sanction a framework that appears settled. The laws themselves are presented as fixed expressions of order, not as fresh decisions responding to circumstance. Earlier legal tablets go further in their restraint. Many lack any reference to divine speech at all. They do not claim that a god commanded a specific judgment. Instead, they proceed as if the correct outcome is already known. The scribe records what is required, not why it is required. This suggests that law functioned as inherited structure rather than ongoing revelation. Just as temple plans were restored rather than redesigned, legal norms were applied rather than invented. The legitimacy of law did not depend on hearing a god speak. It depended on aligning with established form. The language of these tablets reinforces this impression. Verbs are procedural. To give, to pay, to swear, to restore. They describe actions within a known system. There is little room for interpretation. The law is not debated. It is executed. Such rigidity might seem limiting, but it reflects confidence. A society that believes its legal order is complete does not seek continual authorization. The law does not need to be explained because it is already embedded in practice. Like mathematics and astronomy, it works. The role of the scribe is therefore not creative, but custodial. He ensures that the case is recorded correctly, that the formula is followed, that precedent is respected. The law lives in repetition. Each tablet reinforces the next, building authority through accumulation rather than proclamation. This has implications for how divine authority is understood. If the gods no longer speak law into existence, their power must be located elsewhere. It resides not in speech, but in stability. The law reflects divine order precisely because it does not change. Its permanence is its sacred quality. Even when laws evolve, the change is rarely framed as innovation. Adjustments appear as clarifications, restorations, or the system absorbs variation without acknowledging rupture. Continuity is preserved at the level of form, even as content adapts subtly to circumstance. This legal conservatism aligns with the broader pattern of institutional inertia. Authority flows from the past into the present without interruption. The absence of lawgivers does not weaken the law. It strengthens it by removing contingency. The law is not dependent on divine mood or intervention. It stands on its own. The people governed by these laws appear to have accepted this logic. There is no textual evidence of appeal for new divine rulings. Disputes are resolved within the framework, not escalated beyond it. Justice is procedural, not revelatory. In this context, divine names function as anchors rather than voices. They mark the law as legitimate, but they do not animate it. The gods are witnesses to a system already in motion. Their authority is implicit, not articulated. This raises a deeper anthropological question. If law no longer requires a lawgiver, and justice operates through inherited structure alone, then how did this affect the human understanding of responsibility? When outcomes are unjust or harmful, who is accountable? The system, its custodians, or an absent authority that no longer speaks? As law becomes self-sustaining, its silence grows heavier. The tablets tell us what to do, but not who decided it in the first place. And if the Anunnaki no longer speak through law, then where, if anywhere, does judgment still originate when procedure alone is not enough? The law could operate without a lawgiver, because its authority was embedded in form. Medicine reveals a similar transition, though in a domain where one might expect divine intervention to remain central. In the healing texts of Mesopotamia, illness is treated not as a mystery requiring mythic explanation, but as a condition requiring procedure. Diagnostic tablets describe symptoms with careful specificity. A patient presents with pain, swelling, fever, weakness. The text records what is seen, what is felt, what progresses over time. The language is observational, almost detached. Causes are not dramatized. The body is treated as a system that can be read. What is striking is the separation that emerges between ritual and treatment. Incantations exist, but they are increasingly distinct from diagnostic and therapeutic instructions. A tablet may note that an incantation is to be recited, but it does not explain the incantation's power. The core of the text lies in the procedure. Mixtures prepared, substances applied, actions repeated over specified intervals. The healer's authority does not derive from divine speech recorded in the tablet. It derives from correct execution. If the procedure is followed, improvement is expected. Failure is addressed through adjustment, not through appeal to divine displeasure. The gods are present as background, not as agents intervening in each case. This structure suggests that medical knowledge was understood as cumulative and inherited. Remedies are not introduced as new discoveries. They are transmitted as established practice. The texts do not explain how a treatment was first revealed. They assume that the method already exists and that the reader's task is to apply it faithfully. The diagnostic emphasis reinforces this view. Conditions are classified, sometimes with remarkable nuance. Symptoms are correlated with outcomes, durations, and prognoses. The logic is conditional rather than mythic. If this sign appears, then this outcome follows. The body becomes legible through pattern, not narrative. Such an approach implies confidence in the sufficiency of the system. The healer does not need a god to appear and instruct him. He consults the tablet. Authority is located in the archive. The Anunnaki, while not absent, no longer mediate healing directly. Their role has shifted into the inherited structure that makes healing possible. This shift mirrors what is seen in law and astronomy. Divine authority does not vanish. It stabilizes. The gods no longer speak through new revelations. Their order is already embedded in practice. Medicine, like other disciplines, operates within a framework that does not require continual divine correction. The texts themselves reinforce this normalization. They do not dramatize success or failure. They record outcomes with restraint. Improvement is noted without celebration. Death is recorded without explanation. The healer's task is not to interpret divine will, but to apply known procedures correctly. Even when supernatural causes are acknowledged, they are handled procedurally. A condition attributed to a ghost or curse still receives a defined response. Ritual and remedy coexist, but they do not collapse into myth. The incantation does not replace treatment. It accompanies it. The practical sequence remains primary. This coexistence suggests a worldview in which divine forces are real but predictable. They do not act arbitrarily. Their influence can be managed through established means. The healer operates within a system that already accounts for the divine, without requiring direct interaction. The absence of explanatory myth in these texts is therefore not a lack, but a sign of maturity. Medicine has moved from revelation to routine. Knowledge is preserved, not reinvented. The healer inherits methods rather than awaiting instruction. This inheritance also implies responsibility. If healing fails, the fault lies not with silent gods, but with incorrect application. The system assumes competence. Silence from the divine realm does not excuse error. As medicine becomes procedural, it joins the broader pattern of a civilization governed by memory rather than intervention. The Anunnaki no longer instruct healers directly because instruction has already been encoded. The body, like the sky or the law, is governed by order that can be learned and applied. Yet this raises a final uncertainty. If illness can be treated without myth and healing proceeds through inherited technique alone, then what role remains for divine authority in moments when procedure fails, and where does meaning reside when the archive can no longer provide an answer? The procedural confidence that governs medicine and law encounters its most severe tests in the memory of catastrophe. Flood narratives might be expected to mark a rupture so complete that divine presence must return to re-establish order. Yet the records do something quieter. They reset administration without reopening revelation. In the texts, they remember the flood. Destruction is acknowledged, but disorientation is not. The event divides time, but it does not dissolve structure. Post-flood king lists resumed with an air of continuity, not astonishment. Kingship is said to descend again, but the language does not describe gods re-entering the world. Authority reappears without a rival. These king lists are careful documents. They enumerate rulers, cities, durations of reign. The flood is marked as a boundary, but not as a moment requiring renewed instruction. The transition is abrupt, yet orderly. Before the flood, kingship exists. After the flood, kingship exists again. The mechanism of transfer is not narrated, it is assumed. This assumption is telling. If divine withdrawal had required correction, one might expect the flood to function as a return and opportunity for gods to speak anew, to reissue commands, to redesign institutions. Instead, the texts treat the flood as an interruption to be administratively managed. The system pauses and resumes. Bureaucratic continuity supports this reading. Post-flood records restore offices, titles, and procedures that closely resemble earlier forms. Measurement systems persist. Temple ownership is reaffirmed. Legal norms reappear with minimal modification. The archive does not rebuild itself from myth. It restores itself from memory. Even the language used to describe restoration emphasizes retrieval rather than innovation. Kings rebuild cities, re-establish temples, reinstate rights. They do not claim to receive new models. The authority they invoke is ancient, not renewed. The flood does not inaugurate a new order. It clears space for the old one to be reinstated. This framing reframes divine involvement. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as descending again to set things right. Their authority is present, but distant. The system they once established is robust enough to survive catastrophe. Human agents, guided by inherited forms, carry out the work of restoration. Such an approach suggests that the flood functioned as a test of institutional memory. What mattered was not divine reappearance, but the capacity to remember correctly. The archive becomes the instrument of recovery. Lists, plans, and procedures are the tools through which order returns. The king lists themselves embody this logic. They are not stories of survival. They are records of succession. Their purpose is to assert continuity across disruption. By listing rulers before and after the flood in a single sequence, they compress catastrophe into a manageable interval. Time is broken, but authority is not. This compression also neutralizes the need for divine explanation. If kingship can be restored through listing, then the legitimacy of rule does not depend on renewed divine speech. It depends on correct placement within an inherited sequence. The flood does not demand revelation. It demands administration. The same is true of bureaucratic language in post-flood tablets. They do not dwell on loss. They focus on allocation, reconstruction, and reorganization. The tone is practical. The gods are named as owners and guarantors, but they do not act within the narrative. Human institutions do. This does not diminish the flood. Esa significancia, it reframes. Italiano. The disaster is not a moment of divine return, but of human responsibility within a divinely ordered system. The Anunnaki's role is to have established a framework resilient enough to be reactivated without their presence. In T-Sensei, the flood reveals how thoroughly authority has migrated into structure. Even the most disruptive event does not require new instruction. The past is sufficient. Memory does the work that revelation once did. Yet this sufficiency carries a burden. If catastrophe can be absorbed without divine intervention, then meaning must be preserved through record alone. The archive becomes the guarantor, not just of order, but of legitimacy itself. What is remembered determines what is restored. This raises a final implication. If the flood resets administration rather than inviting divine return, then the survival of civilization depends entirely on what is preserved and on who controls preservation. When memory replaces presence, what happens when the archive itself becomes selective, fragmented, or silent? The burden placed on memory after catastrophe makes the archive central. Yet the archive responds in an unexpected way. It preserves with precision, but it does not explain. In the temple repositories where tablets accumulated across generations, knowledge is transmitted through repetition rather than context. The past is coped, not narrated. Scribal school tablets offer the clearest view of this logic. Students are trained by reproducing lists, signs, words, names, quantities. The exercise is exacting. Accuracy matters more than comprehension. The tablet does not ask the novice to understand why a sign carries meaning, only to reproduce it correctly. Learning proceeds through imitation, not inquiry. This pedagogical method extends beyond writing itself. Administrative formulas, legal clauses, and ritual instructions are copied as stable units. Their origins are not discussed. Their authority lies in their survival. To copy is to affirm correctness. To alter is to risk error. Such an approach suggests that the archive is not a space for explanation, but for stabilization. Its purpose is not to tell stories about how systems came into being, but to ensure that those systems continue unchanged. The scribes who maintained these archives were not historians in the modern sense. They were custodians. Temple archives reinforce this custodial role through their organization. Tablets are grouped by function rather than chronology. Lists sit beside lists, accounts beside accounts. The arrangement prioritizes usability over narrative coherence. One consults the archive to perform a task, not to reconstruct an origin. This function orientation explains the absence of contextual stories. Origins belong to a different mode of memory, one that is not required for administration. Once a system is accepted, its beginnings become irrelevant to its operation. The archive remembers what must be done, not how it first came to be. Even when myths are preserved, they are copied alongside administrative texts without commentary linking the two. The relationship between narrative and procedure is implicit, not explained. The archive assumes that legitimacy has already been established elsewhere, at some earlier, unrecorded moment. This silence is deliberate, in effect, if not in intent. By refusing to explain origins, the archive prevents contestation. A system without an explicit beginning cannot be easily challenged. It presents itself as timeless, inherited, and therefore authoritative. Explanation would introduce contingency. Copying preserves inevitability. The scribal emphasis on exact reproduction further reinforces this authority. Errors are corrected swiftly, but questions are not encouraged. The correct tablet is the one that matches its predecessor. Knowledge advances not through reinterpretation, but through fidelity. This method also protects the archive from disruption. After political collapse or environmental disaster, the system can be restored because its components exist independently of narrative. Lists survive where stories fragment. Procedures endure where explanations are lost. In this sense, the archive embodies the same logic seen in architecture and law. It assumes sufficiency. What exists is enough. The past does not need to be it needs to be preserved. The Anunnaki, whose authority once required action, now require only correct remembrance. This transformation places extraordinary trust in the scribal class. They become the mediators of continuity, not by interpreting divine will, but by maintaining textual integrity. Their power lies in selection and transmission. What they choose to copy survives. What they neglect fades. The absence of explanation thus has consequences. Without context, later generations inherit systems without understanding their rationale. They operate within frameworks whose origins are opaque. Authority persists, but meaning becomes procedural rather than conceptual. This opacity may have been acceptable, even desirable. A system that does not explain itself discourages alteration. It demands compliance rather than understanding. In a world where divine instruction is no longer described as ongoing, the archive replaces revelation as the ultimate reference point. Yet this reliance on copying raises a quiet tension. If archives remember without explaining, they preserve form but risk losing intent. Over time, procedures may continue even as their original purposes blur. The system functions, but its meaning thins. The temple archive thus stands as both safeguard and limit. It ensures survival through repetition, but it cannot answer questions it was never designed to address. It remembers what to do, not why it matters. If the Anunnaki's authority now resides in systems maintained by archives that refuse explanation, then how is meaning sustained outside the archive itself, and where did ritual, with its gestures and offerings, fit into a world where memory was preserved without narrative? Ritual occupies the space that explanation leaves open. When archives preserve without narrating, an instruction no longer arrives. Ritual continues the relationship without requiring presence. In the offering lists and liturgical tablets of Mesopotamia, gods are addressed as if they remain accessible, even as the texts no longer describe them as arriving, speaking, or intervening. These ritual records are among the most consistent documents in the archive. They specify quantities, sequences, recipients, and timing with administrative precision. Grain is delivered, animals are slaughtered, libations put at. The tablets record compliance, not encounter. There is no moment where a god is said to appear to receive the offering. Receipt is assumed. What is absent from these texts is as important as what is present. There are no narratives of return. No tablet records a god's re-entry after withdrawal. No description of renewed proximity. The ritual proceeds without such confirmation. Offerings are made because offerings are due, not because a god has demanded them anew. This suggests that ritual functioned as symbolic maintenance rather than interaction. Its purpose was not to invite presence, but to uphold alignment. The gods did not need to be near. Their authority was already established. Ritual preserved the relationship by repetition, not by renewal. The offering lists reinforce this interpretation through their tone. They are bureaucratic documents, concerned with allocation and accountability. A deity's name appears as a destination in a distribution network. The focus is on correct delivery, not on divine response. Silence from the gods does not interrupt the ritual cycle. Even festivals, which might be expected to commemorate divine action, are recorded procedure. Dates are set, items listed, roles assigned. The texts do not recount the mythic significance of the occasion. They ensure that the sequence is performed correctly. Meaning resides in execution. This procedural character implies that ritual had become a form of institutional memory. It reenacted relationships without requiring explanation. Each performance reaffirmed an inherited order, regardless of whether the original rationale was understood. Ritual thus complemented the archive, translating static preservation into embodied action. The absence of narrative also prevents ritual from becoming speculative. By refusing to describe divine movement or intention, the texts avoid attributing change to the gods. Ritual does not respond to divine absence. It assumes continuity. The gods are addressed as if their authority is constant, unaffected by proximity. This constancy allows ritual to survive political and environmental disruption. When cities fall or regimes change, offerings resume according to inherited schedules. New rulers adopt the same rituals to establish legitimacy. The gods do not need to return. Their recognition is activated through performance. In this way, ritual becomes a bridge between presence and absence. It maintains obligation without requiring interaction. The gods are treated as enduring authorities whose acknowledgement does not depend on narrative reinforcement. To perform the ritual is to accept the order it represents. This acceptance also shapes human responsibility. When ritual fails, when offerings are neglected or performed incorrectly, the fault lies with human custodians. The gods are not portrayed as withdrawing or punishing through new acts. Disorder arises from lapse, not from divine decision. Such a framework reinforces the broader transformation observed across disciplines. Authority migrates from action to structure. Divine involvement recedes into precedent. Ritual sustains connection not by calling gods back, but by stabilizing memory. The offering lists thus reveal a quiet adaptation. In the absence of described divine presence, ritual preserves legitimacy through continuity. The gods are not invoked to change the world, but to keep it aligned. Their silence does not diminish their authority. It renders it unchallengeable. Yet ritual's power depends on shared understanding. When the archive no longer explains, and ritual no longer narrates, meaning risks becoming implicit rather than articulated, the gestures continue, but their rationale may fade. Performance preserves form, but not necessarily comprehension. This tension raises an unresolved question. If rituals maintain relationships with authorities no longer described as present, then what sustains belief in those authorities when performance becomes habit rather than encounter, and how long can symbolic maintenance endure once memory itself begins to thin? The logic that allows authority to persist without presence is not confined to southern Mesopotamia. When the evidence is placed alongside records from other early civilizations, a familiar structure emerges, one that does not require contact to function. Similar administrative continuities appear wherever divine authority recedes into inherited form. In the early dynastic record of Egypt, royal inscriptions likewise assume divine order rather than narrate its renewal. Gods authorize kingship, but they do not repeatedly enter the historical scene to instruct. Temple layouts follow established orientations. Calendars regulate ritual and labor with mechanical precision. As in Mesopotamia, catastrophe and dynastic change do not trigger new revelations. Administration resumes according to remembered structure. The parallels extend eastward to the cities of the Indus Valley. There, writing remains limited and undeciphered. But urban regularity speaks clearly. Standardized weights, repeated city plans, and uniform brick ratios suggest a system governed by inherited rules rather than ongoing divine command. The absence of mythic explanation does not prevent continuity. Order persists without narrative. In early China, oracle bone inscriptions from the Shang dynasty preserve a different register of divine interaction. Yet even here a transition is visible. Divination records, questions, and outcomes, not cosmological origins. Over time, ritual and bureaucracy absorb authority, while direct divine speech narrows in scope. The system stabilizes as procedures outlast voices. What unites these cases is not shared theology, but shared institutional logic. Early civilizations appear to reach a point where divine authority no longer needs to be reached. Once order is established, it is preserved through administration, architecture, and ritual. The gods become guarantors rather than participants. Importantly, these similarities do not require diffusion. They arise independently from comparable pressures, managing large populations, coordinating labor, and surviving disruption. In each case, explanation becomes less useful than repetition. Systems endure because they can be restored without renegotiation. This pattern reframes how divine absence is understood. Rather than signaling decline, absence signals sufficiency. Authority embedded in structure proves more durable than authority dependent on presence. Civilization continues, not because gods return, but because memory holds. The comparative view therefore sharpens the Sumerian case without resolving it. Mesopotamia is not unique in preserving order after divine withdrawal. It is distinctive in how clearly its archives revealed the mechanics of that preservation. Across regions, the same question quietly emerges. If civilizations can maintain legitimacy, law, and ritual after divine presence fades from record, then what role do gods continue to play within systems that no longer require them to act hand? Is authority ultimately grounded in belief, or in the structures that belief leaves behind? The comparative view shows that continuity without presence is possible, but collapse tests that possibility more severely than distance ever could. When political authorities fractures, when cities empty and administrations dissolve, one might expect systems to require refounding myths to restore legitimacy. The Mesopotamian record suggests otherwise. After collapse, order returns without narrative renewal. Transitional administrative tablets are the key evidence. These documents appear in periods of disruption. When dynasties end, populations shift, or external pressures reshape governance. Their content is unremarkable. They record rations, labor obligations, land assignments, and deliveries. What is remarkable is their familiarity. The forms persist even when the power structures that once supported them have failed. There is no textual pause in which scribes announce a break with the past. No tablet explains that a new order is being invented to replace a lost one. Instead, the same administrative language resumes under new rulers, often in the same cities, sometimes after intervals of apparent abandonment. The system reactivates itself. This reactivation suggests the collapse was experienced less as an ending than as an interruption. The administrative memories survived outside political continuity. Even when kingship faltered, the practices that defined economic and social life remained legible. When authority returned, it did not need to be justified through myth. It needed only to be applied. The absence of refounding narratives is striking. One might expect new regimes to legitimize themselves by claiming fresh divine mandate or restored presence. Instead, legitimacy is asserted through continuity of procedure. A new ruler proves authority not by revelation, but by competence. By restoring distributions, rebuilding according to old plans, and resuming established rights. This behavior implies confidence in the sufficiency of inherited systems. If the order had required divine renewal, Collapse would have created a vacuum demanding explanation. The archive would have filled that vacuum with narrative. It does not. It fills it with lists. Resilience theory helps frame this pattern. Systems that survive disruption often do so because their core functions are modular and Mesopotamian administration appears to have achieved this modularity early. The essential units, measurements, titles, procedures could be detached from specific political contexts and reassembled when conditions allowed. The scribes play a central role in this process. Their continuity does not depend on kingship alone. They serve temples, estates, and households that persist beyond dynastic change. When collapse occurs, scribal knowledge migrates rather than disappears. The system's memory is carried by people trained to reproduce it. This mobility explains why transitional tablets often look indistinguishable from those produced in stable periods. The archive does not register shock, it registers resumption. From the perspective of administration, collapse is not a narrative event. It is a logistical problem to be solved. The same logic applies to ritual and law. Post-collapse texts do not introduce new rites to compensate for disruption. They reinstate old ones. Legal formulas reappear without modification. Offerings resume to the same deities, in the same quantities, without reference to absence or return. The gods are treated as constant, unaffected by political failure. Such treatment implies that divine authority had already been abstracted from immediate governance. The Anunnaki's role as active overseers had long receded into structural legitimacy. Collapse did not threaten that legitimacy because it was no longer dependent on presence. Authority survived because it was embedded in form. This embedding also limits the scope of collapse. Political structures fall, but cultural memory remains intact. There is no need to explain the world anew because the world is still intelligible through inherited systems. The archive provides continuity without reassurance. Yet this resilience has a cost. By avoiding refounding narratives, the system resists adaptation at the level of meaning. It restores what was, even when conditions have changed. Stability is achieved through repetition, not reflection. Over time, repeated collapses may thin the archive. Gaps appear. Some procedures are preserved more faithfully than others. The system continues, but unevenly. Resilience becomes selective. This selectivity raises a final question. If civilization can survive collapse without refounding myths, relying entirely on inherited administration, then what happens when collapse outpaces memory, when the archive can no longer be fully restored, and continuity itself begins to fragment? By the time the archive thins, the pattern has already set. Across centuries of tablets, economic, legal, ritual, astronomical, one absence remains consistent. The Anunnaki do not leave. Or rather, they are never recorded as leaving. The silence is not localized to one genre or one period. It is systemic. This silence cannot be dismissed as loss alone. Too much survives, too evenly. If departure narratives once existed, they would likely appear at least in fragments, miscopied phrases, displaced formulas. Instead, what persists is a uniform lack of interest in the question itself. The tablets do not ask where the gods went. They do not mark a moment of withdrawal. They do not explain absence, because absence is never acknowledged as a problem. This forces a reconsideration of how evidence functions. Modern historical instinct seeks events, arrivals, departures, turning points. The Mesopotamian archive offers something else. It offers continuity without commentary. The Anunnaki are present as names, as authorities, as owners, long after they cease to act within the texts. Their disappearance, ifitokaret, is administrative rather than narrative. What the tablets never say must therefore be read alongside what they consistently do. They preserve systems. They maintain procedures. They restore order after disruption. They assume legitimacy without renewing it. Silence, in this context, is not ignorance. It is an operational choice. This choice reflects the priorities of those who wrote and preserved the tablets. Scribes were not composing histories of divine movement. They were maintaining the machinery of civilization. Their concern was not cosmic drama, but correct alignment. If a god no longer arrived, that fact did not alter how grain was counted, how labor was assigned, how rituals were performed. From the archive's perspective, nothing essential had changed. This does not mean the scribes believed the gods were gone. It means that divine presence was no longer a variable requiring record. Authority had become fixed. The Anunnaki no longer needed to appear because their role had already been absorbed into structure. The system carried them forward without requiring their motion. Epistemologically, this creates a boundary. The archive can tell us how authority functioned, but not how it was first established or finally transformed. It preserves the middle, not the edges. Origins and endings lie outside its scope. Attempts to force conclusions from this silence risk overreach. To claim that the Anunnaki departed in a literal sense goes beyond what the texts permit. To claim that they never existed as more than symbols also exceeds the evidence. The tablets neither confirm nor deny. They operate as if the question is irrelevant. This irrelevance is itself instructive. It suggests a worldview in which legitimacy does not depend on ongoing validation. Once order is set, it persists until it fails. The gods are not required to justify themselves repeatedly. Their authority is not conversational. It is constitutional. The absence of departure narratives across centuries indicates that no rupture was experienced at the level that demanded explanation. Even catastrophe, the flood, collapse, invasion, not trigger a reappearance of divine speech. The system resumed without comment. Memory replaced encounter. For the modern reader, this can feel unsatisfying. We are trained to expect closure. The archive offers none. It resists interpretation that seeks final answers. Instead, it enforces restraint. We are allowed to observe patterns, shifts in language, changes in emphasis. We are not invited to reconstruct unwitnessed events. Treating silence as data does not mean filling it with speculation. It means respecting its shape. The silence here is consistent, distributed, and functional. It aligns with a civilization that understood itself as inheriting order rather than inventing it anew. The Anunnaki are part of that inheritance, carried forward even when no longer described as present. In Tislate, the most important thing the tablets never say is not where the gods went, but that they ever needed to go anywhere. Movement belongs to stories. The archive belongs to stability. When authority becomes embedded in systems, departure ceases to be a meaningful category. What remains, then, is not an answer, but a limit. The Sumerian texts allow us to trace how divine authority becomes structural, how presence becomes precedent, how memory replaces instruction. They do not allow us to narrate a final scene, and perhaps that restraint is itself the final record. A civilization that chose not to explain the fate of its highest authorities may have understood something fundamental, that once order is preserved without presence, the question of departure no longer belongs to history at all but to the assumptions we bring when we expect the past to speak in our terms rather than its own.